Ancient Rome, emperors vs slaves. Tonight we're traveling back to a time when simply surviving a single day required more strength than most of us will ever need. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let me tell you about lives so difficult they'll make your own troubles seem beautifully simple. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. The slaves. You are a slave in ancient Rome. In the year 117 AD, during the height of the empire under Emperor Trajan, you wake before dawn in the underground chambers beneath a patrician villa, sleeping on a straw mat in a stone cell that you share with 12 other slaves, breathing air that's thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and the dampness that never leaves these subterranean quarters. Your bed is nothing more than dirty straw spread on cold stone, covered by a thin blanket that provides little warmth against the chill that seeps through the villa's foundations. The cell has no windows, no natural light, and no privacy. Just stone walls that weep moisture and iron bars that remind you constantly that you are property, not a person. You dress in the same rough tunic you've worn for weeks, a garment made pret from the cheapest cloth available, dyed brown to hide the stains that accumulate from work so demanding that cleanliness becomes impossible. Your feet are bare, because shoes are luxuries that slaves don't receive, and the calluses that cover your soles are thick enough to walk on broken pottery without bleeding. The work bell rings before sunrise, a harsh bronze clang that summons pew from the few hours of rest that slavery allows, calling you to another day of labor that will consume every moment of daylight and continue into the evening by torch and lamplight. There is no choice, no negotiation, no possibility of refusing the demands that will be placed on your body and spirit. You climb the narrow stone stairs from the slave quarters to the villa proper, emerging into a world of marble and luxury that exists entirely for others' pleasure, while your labor makes it possible. The contrast is immediate and crushing, from damp stone cells to bright courtyards filled with fountains, gardens, and artwork worth more than you could earn in lifetimes of freedom. Your first task is lighting the hypocaust fires that heat the villa's floors and walls, a system that requires you to crawl through narrow tunnels beneath the building, feeding coal and wood into furnaces that create temperatures hot enough to warm marble floors for bare patrician feet. The work is performed in spaces barely large enough for human bodies, in heat that makes breathing difficult, in darkness broken only by the fires you tend. The tunnels are cramped, airless, and filled with smoke that burns your lungs and stings your eyes until tears stream down your face. You work by feel as much as sight, navigating passages that wind beneath the entire villa, carrying fuel that weighs more than you can comfortably manage, maintaining fires that must never be allowed to die. The hypocaust system is ingenious and efficient, but it requires constant human attention from slaves who crawl through spaces designed for access rather than comfort, who breathe smoke and heat for hours at a time, who emerge from the tunnels blackened with soot and gasping for clean air that tastes like luxury after the suffocating atmosphere below. After tending the heating system, you join the cleaning crews that maintain the villa's impossible standards of cleanliness and beauty. Every surface must be spotless, every mosaic floor scrubbed until the tiny tiles gleam like jewels, every fresco cleaned with such care that colors remain vibrant despite the constant attention they receive. You scrub marble floors on your hands, foot and knees, using brushes made from pig bristles and cleaning solutions that burn your skin and leave permanent stains on your hands. The marble is beautiful but unforgiving, requiring techniques that remove every trace of dirt without damaging stone that costs more than entire families of slaves. The mosaics are works of art that tell stories of gods and heroes, created by master craftsmen using thousands of tiny colored stones arranged in patterns of incredible complexity and beauty. You clean these masterpieces with soft cloths and gentle solutions, knowing that damage to irreplaceable artwork would result in punishment severe enough to cripple or kill. Water must be carried constantly throughout the villa, because Roman luxury demands fountains that flow continuously, baths that are filled and emptied multiple times daily, and gardens that remain green and beautiful regardless of weather or season. You carry amphora after amphora of water from wells and cisterns, your shoulders permanently marked by the ropes that distribute the weight of liquid that seems to weigh more with each trip. The gardens require endless attention, because patrician Romans expect natural beauty that appears effortless but demands constant human labor to maintain. You tend plants that have been imported from across the empire, flowers that require specific soil conditions, trees that need careful pruning, and lawns that must be kept perfectly manicured despite the traffic of visitors who walk across them, without considering the work required to restore their appearance. Kitchen work is another form of torture, because Roman dining demands elaborate meals that require hours of preparation for banquets that last minutes. You assist cooks who prepare dishes using ingredients from across the known world, techniques that require precision and timing, and presentations that must be perfect despite the chaos of professional kitchens operating at maximum capacity. The heat in the kitchens is overwhelming, generated by multiple ovens burning simultaneously, by cooking fires that roar like furnaces, and by the press of bodies working in spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. You sweat constantly, drink enormous quantities of water that your body demands, and learn to function despite dehydration that leaves you dizzy and weak. Food preparation requires handling knives sharp enough to slice through bone, working with hot oil that splashes and burns exposed skin, and moving at speeds that leave no margin for error when dealing with equipment that can maim or kill careless workers. You develop reflexes that border on supernatural, because survival depends on avoiding injuries that would make you useless and therefore disposable. The dining service itself is a carefully choreographed performance where slaves must remain invisible while providing perfect attention to guests who treat them as animate furniture. You carry heavy trays loaded with food and wine, navigate crowded rooms without spilling anything, and anticipate needs before they're expressed, all while pretending not to hear conversations that reveal the intimate details of Roman political and social life. Roman banquets are displays of wealth that consume resources thoughtlessly, featuring courses that include delicacies from every corner of the empire, wines that cost fortunes, and entertainment that demonstrates the host's cultural sophistication and political connections. You serve foods you'll never taste, pour wines worth more than your life, and watch Romans consume in hours what would feed slave families for months between meals. You clean and maintain the villa's countless rooms, each with specific requirements for care and attention. The library must be dusted without damaging scrolls that contain irreplaceable knowledge. The atrium must be swept and polished to maintain surfaces that reflect light in patterns designed by architects. And bedrooms must be prepared with linens, changed daily despite the enormous labor required for washing and pressing. Laundry is a nightmare of hot water, harsh chemicals, and physical demands that destroy hands and backs through repetitive motions performed for hours without rest. Roman clothing is complex, layered, and made from fabrics that require specific care to maintain appearance and durability. You wash, rinse, wring, bend, hang clothing that will be worn once before requiring the same intensive cleaning process. The fulling process involves stamping on clothes in vats of urine and clay, chemicals that clean wool but burn human skin that's exposed to them for hours at a time. You develop sores and rashes that never fully heal, because the work continues regardless of physical damage to workers, who are valued only for their productivity. Personal service to family members requires different skills but equal endurance, because patrician Romans expect attention that anticipates their every need while remaining completely unobtrusive. You dress masters and mistresses in clothing that requires careful handling, assist with bathing rituals that involve oils and perfumes worth fortunes, and maintain personal items that demonstrate wealth and status. The baths are daily rituals that require constant preparation, heating water to precise temperatures, arranging oils and strigils, ensuring that towels are perfectly clean and dry, and maintaining facilities that represent the pinnacle of Roman domestic luxury. You work in steam and heat that makes breathing difficult, handling equipment that can burn if touched at the wrong moment. Evening brings no rest, because Roman social life continues long past sunset, requiring lighting that illuminates the villa. Like daylight, food service that extends banquets for hours, and maintenance that prepares for the following day's identical demands. You light oil lamps throughout the villa, trim wicks to ensure even burning, and replenish fuel that keeps darkness at bay. That the oil lamps require constant attention, because poorly maintained lighting creates smoke that stains frescoes, flames that can ignite furnishings, and odors that offend patrician sensibilities. You will become expert at judging flame height, oil quality, and wick condition by sight and smell. Because mistakes in lighting result in punishment that teaches lessons through pain. Sleep comes only when the family retires and the villa settles into the quiet maintenance mode that prepares for another day of identical service. You collapse onto your straw mat in the slave quarters, too exhausted to care about the cold stone, the dampness, or the sounds of other slaves coughing, crying, or talking quietly about lives that existed before slavery claimed them. Your dreams, when exhaustion allows them, are filled with memories of freedom, family, and the life that was stolen when Roman armies conquered your homeland and made you property to be bought, sold, and used until your body breaks or your spirit finally surrenders to despair that consumes slaves who live too long without hope. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same demands, the same invisible labor that maintains Roman luxury while consuming human lives, one day at a time. The hypocaust fires must be tended, the floors must be scrubbed, the meals must be served, and the villa must continue operating with the perfection that Romans expect from systems built on slave labor. This is your life as a Roman slave, an existence so completely controlled by others that your humanity becomes secondary to your utility, where your value is measured only by your ability to serve masters who see you as equipment rather than as a person, deserving of consideration, respect, or hope. The villa continues its daily rhythm of luxury and service, beauty and suffering, patrician pleasure and slave pain. A system that represents the height of Roman civilization, while revealing the human cost of empire built on the assumption that some people exist only to serve others who were born into better circumstances. The Emperor. You are Emperor Hadrian, ruler of the Roman Empire. In the year 128 AD, you wake in your private chambers in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by luxury that exceeds anything previously imagined in human history, served by hundreds of slaves whose only purpose is ensuring that your every desire is anticipated and fulfilled before you're even aware of wanting anything. Your bed is a masterpiece of craftsmanship, worth more than entire cities. Ivory inlaid with gold and precious stones, covered with silk so fine it feels like liquid, surrounded by curtains woven from threads of silver that shimmer in the light of oil lamps that burn throughout the night to ensure you never wake in darkness. The chambers around you contain art treasures looted from across the empire, Greek sculptures that represent the pinnacle of artistic achievement, paintings by masters whose names will be remembered for millennia, and decorative objects crafted from materials so rare they exist in no other collection on earth. You dress not in clothing, but in imperial regalia that transforms your body into a symbol of divine power. Robes woven from silk, dyed with purple that costs more than armies. Jewelry crafted from gems that represent the wealth of conquered nations. And accessories that announce your status as ruler of the known world. Your morning routine includes being attended by slaves who have been trained specifically for imperial service body servants who bathe you in water perfumed with oils from distant lands, barbers who maintain your appearance with instruments made from the finest metals, and dressers who arrange clothing designed to demonstrate that you are more than human. Breakfast is a feast that would satisfy hundreds of ordinary people. Fruits imported from every corner of the empire, meats prepared by cooks whose skills have been perfected through generations of imperial service, breads made from grain so fine it exists only for your table, and beverages that have traveled thousands of miles to reach your lips. The food is served on plates made from gold and silver, eaten with utensils crafted by master smiths, and presented with artistry that makes each meal a work of visual beauty as well as culinary excellence. You consume casually what represents months of labor by countless workers, farmers, and craftsmen, whose efforts exist solely to satisfy imperial appetite. Your daily schedule is structured around activities that demonstrate your power, while providing entertainment that prevents the boredom that could accompany unlimited luxury. You review reports from governors who rule distant provinces in your name, make decisions that affect millions of people, and receive visitors who have traveled across the empire for the privilege of brief audiences with divine authority. The palace itself is a city within the city, covering hundreds of acres with buildings designed to accommodate every aspect of imperial life. Private chambers for personal comfort, public halls for state ceremonies, libraries containing the wisdom of the ancient world, and gardens that represent natural beauty perfected through human art and unlimited resources. Your private gardens are landscapes designed by master architects who have created artificial environments more beautiful than anything nature provides. Fountains that celebrate engineering genius. Plantings that combine species from throughout the empire. And pathways that lead through carefully planned vistas designed to inspire contemplation of imperial greatness. The fountains alone represent the engineering achievements that demonstrate Roman mastery over natural forces. Water flows in patterns designed by mathematicians, creates music through precisely calculated pressures, and provides cooling that makes even summer heat comfortable for imperial comfort. Political meetings occur in chambers designed to intimidate visitors with displays of imperial power, ceilings painted with scenes of Roman triumph, walls decorated with maps showing the extent of your dominion, and furnishings that remind everyone that they are in the presence of someone who rules the world. Your advisors approach these meetings with the knowledge that their careers, fortunes, and lives depend entirely on your approval. That imperial displeasure can result in exile, confiscation of property, or death, and that service to the emperor requires complete subordination of personal interests to imperial will. Military reviews allow you to inspect forces that maintain Roman power throughout the known world. Legions equipped with the finest weapons and armor. Cavalry mounted on horses bred specifically for imperial service. And auxiliaries drawn from conquered peoples, who now serve the empire that defeated their ancestors. These military displays are carefully choreographed demonstrations of force that remind everyone, including yourself, that imperial power ultimately rests on the ability to command violence more sophisticated and overwhelming than any rival can match. Cultural activities provide entertainment appropriate for someone whose education and refinement exceed anything available to ordinary Romans. Private performances by the finest musicians and actors, readings by poets who compete for imperial patronage, and discussions with philosophers whose ideas shaped the intellectual life of the empire. Your library contains scrolls and books that represent the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, works by Greek philosophers, Roman historians, and scholars from conquered territories whose learning has been absorbed into imperial collections that exist nowhere else on Earth. Evening entertainments are spectacles designed specifically for imperial amusement. Banquets featuring delicacies from every province. Performances by artists who have devoted their lives to achieving perfection in their crafts and social gatherings. Attended by the most powerful and cultured people in the Roman world. The banquet hall itself is an architectural marvel designed to accommodate hundreds of guests, while maintaining intimacy that allows conversation, appreciation of food and wine, and entertainment that demonstrates the cultural sophistication that distinguishes Roman civilization from barbarian societies. Wine flows from amphorae that contain vintages from the finest vineyards in the empire, each selected for specific occasions, served at temperatures calculated to enhance flavor, and presented in vessels crafted from precious metals and decorated with artistic excellence that makes drinking an aesthetic experience. Imperial baths provide relaxation that restores your body and spirit after days filled with decisions that affect millions of people. Water heated to precise temperatures. Oils that have been blended specifically for imperial use. And massage techniques that have been perfected through generations of service to Roman rulers. The bath complex within the palace exceeds anything available to ordinary Romans, featuring pools of different temperatures, steam rooms designed to promote health and relaxation, and facilities for exercise that maintain the physical fitness appropriate for someone who embodies the strength of the empire itself. Personal attendant ensure that every moment of your life occurs in circumstances designed for maximum comfort and efficiency. Slaves who anticipate your needs before you express them. Servants who maintain your environment with attention to details, so small they're invisible, but whose absence would diminish the perfection that imperial life demands. Travel occurs in luxury that transforms. Movement from inconvenience to pleasure. Litters carried by slaves trained specifically for imperial transport. Accommodations prepared in advance at every stop. And security provided by forces adequate to guarantee safety, regardless of destination or political circumstances. Your personal guard consists of soldiers whose loyalty has been tested through years of service, whose equipment represents the finest military technology available, and whose training prepares them to protect imperial life against any conceivable threat from assassination to rebellion. Evening brings retirement to chambers designed for rest and contemplation. Bedrooms decorated with art that inspires peaceful sleep. Furnishings that provide comfort beyond anything experienced by ordinary humans. And silence ensured by walls thick enough to block all sounds except those specifically intended for imperial ears. Sleep comes easily because imperial life is structured to eliminate stress, anxiety, and physical discomfort that plague ordinary existence. Every need anticipated, every desire fulfilled, every problem solved by others whose expertise and devotion exist solely to serve imperial welfare. Your dreams, when luxury permits, bear them, are filled with visions of eternal glory, architectural projects that will bear your name forever, and achievements that will ensure imperial immortality through monuments and institutions that outlast individual life to become permanent. Features of human civilization. Tomorrow will bring the same luxury, the same power, the same endless service, from people whose lives are devoted entirely to imperial comfort and glory. The empire exists to serve your will. The palace operates to provide perfect conditions for imperial life, and millions of people work to sustain a system designed around the assumption that your happiness and success justify any sacrifice demanded from others. This is your life as Roman emperor, an existence so elevated above ordinary humanity that your individual desires become the organizing principle for the largest and most sophisticated political system the world has ever seen, where your personal comfort requires the labor of millions, and your individual will shapes the destiny of entires civilizations. The empire continues its daily rhythm of conquest and administration, luxury and service, imperial pleasure and subject sacrifice, a system that represents the height of human political achievement, while revealing the concentration of power and resources in the hands of a single person, whose birth granted access to privileges beyond the imagination of those who serve imperial greatness. Now let me tell you the story of Marcus, a slave whose life represents the journey from freedom to bondage, from human dignity to property status, from hope to the kind of despair that consumes people who discover that survival requires abandoning everything that makes life meaningful. Marcus was born free in 89 AD in a village in Dacia, beyond the Danube River, where his father was a blacksmith who served the community's needs for tools, weapons, and the ironwork that made agricultural life possible in territory that would later be conquered and absorbed into the Roman Empire. His childhood was spent learning metalworking skills that connected him to traditions stretching back generations, developing the strength and dexterity required for forge work, and preparing for a life of respected craftsmanship that would serve his community, while providing personal satisfaction and economic security. The village was small but prosperous, supporting families through agriculture supplemented by crafts, bound trade that connected Dacian communities to networks extending throughout the region. Marcus learned not just blacksmithing, but also the social skills required for negotiating with customers, managing materials, and maintaining relationships that made business viable. When Marcus turned 16, his father began teaching him the advanced techniques required for creating weapons, the specialized knowledge that distinguished master smiths from ordinary metalworkers, and the business practices that would allow him to establish his own forge when he reached full adulthood. But in 106 AD, when Marcus was 17, Roman legions under Emperor Trajan launched the final campaign that conquered Dacia and transformed free Dacians into subjects of the empire. The conquest was swift, brutal, and complete, designed to eliminate resistance while capturing maximum numbers of slaves for Roman markets. Marcus fought alongside other village men in desperate attempts to defend territory that had been Dacian for centuries. But their weapons and tactics were no match for Roman military organization, engineering, tell you how to, and the overwhelming force that characterized imperial conquest when the empire decided to expand its boundaries. The battle lasted 3 days before Dacian resistance collapsed under pressure that killed most of the warriors and captured the survivors for transport to slave markets throughout the empire. Marcus watched his father die defending the forge where he had learned his craft, saw his village burned by soldiers who destroyed everything they couldn't carry, and experienced the transformation from free craftsmen to human property. The march to Roman territory took 6 weeks through mountain passes and river valleys that Marcus had known as hunting grounds, but now traversed in chains that connected him to other captives being transported to lives of slavery. Many died during the journey from wounds, exhaustion, or despair that made them abandon the will to continue living. The slave market in Rome was Marcus's introduction to economic systems that treated human beings as merchandise to be evaluated, purchased, and consumed according to buyer preferences and market conditions. He was stripped, examined for physical defects, and displayed alongside other Dacian captives for inspection by potential purchasers. His youth, strength, and obvious intelligence made Marcus valuable to buyers, seeking slaves for demanding work that required both physical capability and mental acuity. After 3 days of exhibition, he was purchased by Lucius Domitius Corbulo, a wealthy senator who owned villas in Rome and the countryside that required large staffs of skilled slaves. Marcus's first assignment was construction work on a villa being built outside Rome, labor that required strength, endurance, and the ability to follow complex instructions, while working with materials and techniques that exceeded anything he had experienced in Dacian village life. The construction site operated like a military camp, with overseers who enforced discipline through punishment that ranged from reduced food rations to beatings, severe enough to incapacitate workers who failed to meet productivity standards or challenged authority in any way. Marcus learned quickly that survival required suppressing his identity as a free Dacian craftsman and adapting to status as Roman property, whose value depended entirely on ability to perform assigned tasks without complaint. Resistance or any expression of the anger that burned constantly in his chest. The work was physically demanding, but not technically challenging for someone trained in metalworking. So Marcus completed assignments efficiently while observing Roman construction techniques that impressed him despite his hatred for the people who enslaved him. After 2 years of construction work, Marcus's skills and reliability earned him transfer to Corbulo's Roman villa, where he joined the household staff responsible for maintaining the luxury that characterized patrician life in the capital of the world's largest empire. Villa service required different skills but equal dedication, because Roman domestic standards demanded perfection in every detail, cleanliness that required constant attention, food service that satisfied sophisticated tastes, repair and maintenance of beautiful objects that represented artistic achievements from throughout the empire. Marcus's background in metalwork made him valuable for maintaining the villa's bronze fixtures, iron hardware, and decorative objects that required specialized knowledge for proper care. This work brought him into contact with Roman craftsmanship that exceeded Dacian techniques, while serving purposes that seemed frivolous compared to village smithing. The villa's bronze doors required daily polishing to maintain surfaces that gleamed like mirrors. Iron locks needed oiling and adjustment to operate smoothly, and decorative metalwork demanded cleaning that preserved artistic details while removing the tarnish that accumulated from Roman air pollution. Working inside the villa exposed Marcus to luxury that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Rooms decorated with frescoes that told stories from Greek mythology, mosaics that depicted scenes from across the empire, and furnishings that demonstrated wealth beyond the comprehension of people raised in Dacian villages. The contrast between his slave quarters and the villa proper was a daily reminder of the inequality that characterized Roman society, from cramped stone cells where slaves slept on straw to marble chambers where Romans rested on silk, from coarse bread that barely sustained life to elaborate meals that wasted food casually. Marcus learned to hate Roman luxury, not because it was beautiful, but because he understood the human cost of maintaining standards that required constant slave labor while providing no benefit to the people whose work made patrician comfort possible. After 5 years of villa service, Marcus had adapted to slavery while preserving enough of his original identity to maintain hope that circumstances might eventually change, that the empire might fall, or that he might find opportunity to escape and return to whatever remained of his homeland. But escape attempts were punished by crucifixion. Running away was nearly impossible in a society where slaves were easily recognized and systematically recaptured. And news from Dacia suggested that Roman colonization had destroyed the communities and culture that had given his life meaning before conquest. Marcus began to understand that slavery was designed to be permanent, that Roman law treated slaves as property rather than people, and that his life would be spent serving masters who saw him as equipment rather than as a human being deserving of consideration or respect. The psychological adaptation to permanent slavery required abandoning hope accepting circumstances that couldn't be changed, and finding ways to maintain sanity while performing tasks that served no purpose except increasing the comfort of people who had destroyed his life and his people's freedom. Marcus developed relationships with other slaves that provided emotional support and practical assistance, forming communities within the larger system of oppression that offered solidarity, shared experience, and the kind of mutual aid that made unbearable circumstances slightly more tolerable. When Marcus was 35, 18 years after his capture, he had survived longer than most slaves, while maintaining enough physical and mental health to continue serving Roman masters who replaced each other as properties were sold, inherited, or confiscated through political changes that affected owners but not their human property. He died at 41 from lung disease, caused by years of breathing air polluted by Roman industrial activities, his body worn out by decades of physical labor performed without adequate rest, nutrition, or medical care. His death was recorded as a minor property loss in estate accounts that noted the need to purchase replacement slaves. Marcus was buried in a slave cemetery outside Rome. His grave, unmarked except for a number that identified his remains for record-keeping purposes. No mourners attended his funeral, except fellow slaves who understood that his death represented their own future, anonymous, unremembered, and economically insignificant to the empire that had consumed his life. In the winter of 134 AD, something extraordinary began happening in the slave quarters beneath patrician villas throughout Rome. It started with reports of phantom workers who completed tasks overnight, invisible hands that maintained facilities to standards exceeding anything living slaves could achieve, and supernatural assistance that reduced the burden of labor that destroyed so many lives. The first incidents were reported by overseers who discovered that work assignments had been completed during hours when slave quarters were locked, and no human activity was supposed to occur. Floors had been scrubbed to perfection, bronze had been polished to mirror brightness, and maintenance tasks had been performed with skill that exceeded the capabilities of ordinary slave labor. Similar reports came from villas throughout the city describing identical phenomena, work completed by invisible hands, facilities maintained by supernatural forces, and improvements that suggested the intervention of spirits who understood Roman domestic standards better than living workers. Marcus, now a veteran slave with 15 years of villa experience, initially dismissed these reports as wishful thinking or attempts by fellow slaves to explain unusually productive work periods through supernatural rather than natural causes. But when Marcus witnessed similar phenomena in Corbulo's villa, he was forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal experience was occurring in Roman slavery. Tools appeared where none had been left. Repairs were completed without human intervention, and cleaning was performed to standards that exceeded anything living slaves could achieve. The phantom workers seemed to understand the specific requirements comprise of individual households, completing tasks according to standards that had been established through years of training and punishment, demonstrating knowledge that could only have come from experience with Roman domestic expectations. Most remarkably, the supernatural assistance seemed to reduce the physical and psychological burden of slavery, allowing living slaves to complete assignments without the exhaustion that normally accompanied villa service, creating time for rest and social interaction that had been impossible under normal working conditions. The phenomena continued for several months, gradually becoming systematic and reliable. Slaves reported encountering ghostly figures who worked alongside them, who demonstrated techniques that improved efficiency and quality, and who seemed motivated by solidarity with living workers rather than loyalty to Roman masters. Some slaves claimed to recognize the spectral workers as former colleagues who had died in service, family members who had been separated during capture, or fellow Dacians who continued fighting Roman oppression through supernatural means that transcended the limitations of physical death. The phantom assistants provided not just practical help, but also psychological comfort, suggesting that death was not the end of resistance to slavery, that community bonds persisted beyond individual mortality, and that the spirits of the dead continued to care for the living who suffered under Roman oppression. The supernatural activity gradually faded as political conditions changed and new policies reduced some of the worst abuses of slavery, as if the ghostly intervention had been temporary assistance during a particularly harsh period of Roman treatment of human property. Slave communities never forgot the winter when invisible colleagues had helped them survive working conditions that seemed designed to destroy both body and spirit, when supernatural forces had demonstrated that solidarity transcended death, and when the dead had returned to assist the living in their struggle against impossible circumstances. The mystery became part of slave folklore, stories that provided hope during the darkest periods of bondage, comfort during moments of despair, and evidence that community bonds were stronger than the legal systems that treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, and consumed. While Marcus suffered in the slave quarters beneath Corbulo's villa, a completely different reality existed in the imperial palace, where Emperor Hadrian lived in luxury that exceeded the imagination of ordinary Romans and represented the concentration of empires. Wealth in the hands of a single person whose individual desires shaped the destiny of millions. The contrast between imperial life and slave existence was so extreme that they seemed to represent different species rather than different social positions within the same society. Hadrian consumed in a single meal what would sustain slave families for months, wasted casually what working people desperately needed, and enjoyed privileges that represented the accumulated labor of entire civilizations. The emperor's daily routine was structured around activities that demonstrated divine status while providing entertainment that prevented boredom, reviewing reports that summarized the governance of territories larger than entire modern nations, making decisions that affected trade routes connecting 3 continents, and receiving tribute that represented the wealth extracted from conquered peoples. His palace chambers contained art treasures that had been looted from across the known world. Greek sculptures that represented centuries of artistic development, Egyptian artifacts that connected Rome to ancient civilizations, and decorative objects crafted from materials so rare they existed in no other collection on Earth. When Hadrian required construction services, he commanded resources that dwarfed anything available to ordinary projects. Thousands of workers organized according to imperial specifications, materials imported regardless of cost, and engineering expertise applied to structures designed to demonstrate Roman power for centuries to come. The emperor's understanding of slavery was purely theoretical, based on economic reports rather than direct observation of working conditions, focused on productivity statistics rather than human welfare, concerned with efficiency rather than the moral implications of treating human beings as property. Hadrian's architectural projects required slave labor on scales that consumed thousands of lives, quarries that provided marble for imperial buildings, construction sites where workers died regularly from accidents and exhaustion, and engineering projects that prioritized imperial glory over human cost. When the emperor died at 62, his death was mourned throughout the empire as the loss. Tell a ruler whose wisdom and cultural achievements had elevated Roman civilization to unprecedented heights. But the slaves whose labor had made his reign possible were not represented at imperial funeral ceremonies. The contrast between Hadrian's immortality through monumental architecture and Marcus's anonymous death in a slave cemetery represented the fundamental inequality that characterized Roman society, where individual imperial desires justified any sacrifice demanded from people who lacked the political power to resist exploitation. Both men lived in the same empire, were subject to the same laws and institutions, and depended ultimately on the same economic system. But they experienced completely different realities based on their positions in social hierarchies that concentrated all benefits at the top while distributing all costs to the bottom. By 148, Roman slavery had become a sophisticated system that supplied labor for every aspect of imperial civilization while maintaining legal and social structures that prevented slaves from challenging their bondage or achieving the freedom that would allow them to benefit from their own productivity. The slave communities had developed their own cultures, their own forms of resistance, and their own methods of survival that helped individuals endure circumstances designed to break human spirit while serving Roman economic interests that depended on maintaining large populations of unpaid workers. These communities preserved languages, traditions, and identity from conquered territories, creating underground networks that maintained connections to homelands and cultures that Rome had attempted to destroy through conquest and colonization. The experience of slaves like Marcus demonstrated that human beings could survive conditions that seemed designed to destroy both physical health and psychological integrity. that community solidarity could persist despite legal systems that treated people as property, and that resistance could take forms that transcended individual capacity for rebellion. And so we leave ancient Rome, where marble gleamed with the blood of conquered peoples, where emperors lived like gods while slaves died like animals, where the greatest civilization the world had known was built on the assumption that some humans existed only to serve others who were born into better circumstances. These contrasting lives reveal the price of empire, the human cost of luxury, and the moral foundations of political systems that concentrate all power and wealth in the hands of the few, while distributing all suffering among the many who lack the strength to resist or the opportunity to escape. Emperor Hadrian and the slave Marcus lived in the same city, breathed the same air, and depended on the same economic system. But they inhabited worlds so different they might have been separate species, one divine and immortal, the other human and disposable, both products of an empire that created unprecedented beauty through unprecedented cruelty. The marble halls still echo with phantom footsteps. The slave quarters still whisper with the voices of the dead. And the contrast between imperial palace and underground cells still challenges our understanding of what civilization means when it requires some people to live in luxury while others die in chains. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your private bed, with freedom to choose your work and keep its rewards, remember the Roman slaves in their stone cells, sharing straw mats with strangers, breathing air thick with despair, serving masters who saw them as equipment rather than people deserving of consideration, respect, or hope. Their chains have been broken, their cells have crumbled, and their names have been forgotten by everyone except the historians who remember that civilizations are built on foundations that include both marble and bones, both monuments and graveyards, both the immortal achievements we celebrate and the mortal sacrifices we prefer not to remember. The Roman Empire created beauty that still inspires, engineering that still amazes, and political achievements that still influence modern governance. But it also demonstrated that human progress can coexist with human suffering, that artistic magnificence can emerge from moral corruption, and that the price of greatness is often paid by people who receive none of its benefits. Emperor and slave, palace and cell, divine luxury and human misery, all existed within the same system that represented both the best and worst of human capability, both our potential for creating beauty and our capacity for justifying cruelty when it serves the interests of those who possess the power to impose their will on others. Sleep well, knowing that your rest is your own, that your life belongs to you, that your labor serves your own purposes rather than enriching masters who see you as property. The Roman slaves earned these freedoms for us through their sufferings, their endurance, and their faith that individual dignity could survive even the most complete forms of human oppression. Good night. Renaissance Italy. Medici princes vs. plague doctors. The plague doctors You are a plague doctor in Florence, Italy, in the year 1478. The Black Death has returned to the city like a familiar demon, spreading through narrow streets and crowded tenements with the efficiency of spilled wine soaking through cloth, transforming the cradle of Renaissance culture into a charnel house where beauty and horror exist side by side. Your day begins before dawn in the small chamber you rent near the city walls, far from the wealthy districts where death is an inconvenience rather than a constant companion. You dress in the costume that marks you as both healer and harbinger of doom. A long black robe made from waxed leather that supposedly protects against the poisonous air that carries plague, and the distinctive beak-shaped mask that has become the symbol of your profession. The beak mask is filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and dried flowers that are believed to purify the corrupt air that spreads disease through the city's population. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, and dozens of other plants create a mixture that provides some relief from the overwhelming stench of death that permeates every corner of plague-stricken Florence. Your leather gloves extend to your elbows, and your boots are tall enough to wade through the filth that accumulates in streets where normal sanitation has collapsed under the weight of too many dead and too few living to maintain the basic services that keep cities habitable. We carry a wooden staff that allows you to examine patients without direct contact, because touch means death more often than it means healing. The costume is terrifying to behold, designed as much to protect the doctor's identity as his body, because plague physicians are both essential and despised, needed for their skills, but feared for their association with death. Children run when they see you approaching. Mothers cross themselves and whisper prayers, and grown men step aside to avoid any chance of accidental contact. Your first call is to a tenement in the Oltrarno district, where an entire family has fallen ill during the night. The building is 4 stories of cramped apartments where artisans and laborers live in conditions that would have been considered squalid even before the plague turned them into death traps, where disease spreads through shared walls, contaminated water, and the simple act of breathing the same air. You climb narrow wooden stairs that creak under your weight, past doors that hang open to reveal rooms where the living and dead share space, because survivors lack the strength to remove bodies but putrefy in the summer heat. The smell is overwhelming despite your aromatic beak, a combination of decay, human waste, and the particular sweet sick odor that marks houses where plague has taken residence. The family you've come to examine consists of 7 people in various stages of the disease that has no cure, no reliable treatment, and no mercy for age, health, or social position. The father shows the characteristic swellings in his neck and armpits that marked the beginning of bubonic plague, lumps that will grow larger and more painful until they rupture or kill him. You examine each patient with your wooden staff, looking for the black spots that indicate the disease has progressed beyond any hope of recovery, feeling for fever through thick gloves that make diagnosis more art than science, and making notes in a ledger that records symptoms. treatments attempted, and outcomes that are almost universally fatal. The treatments you can offer are pathetic compared to the disease's power. Bloodletting that weakens patients who are already dying. Herbal remedies that provide comfort but no cure. And prayers that seem to go unanswered in a city where churches fill with corpses faster than priests can perform last rites for the faithful who believed devotion would protect them. You lance the buboes with a knife heated in flame, draining pus and blood in procedures that cause agony but sometimes provide temporary relief from pressure that makes movement impossible for patients who writhe in pain that exceeds human ability to endure without losing sanity along with hope. Recovery. The bloodletting is performed with leeches when available, or with cuts made in specific locations that are supposed to balance the humors that medieval medicine believes control health and disease. You watch patients grow paler and weaker as blood flows into bowls, knowing that you are probably hastening death while following the only medical knowledge available in an age when disease is understood through superstition rather than science. Between patient visits, you walk through streets that have been transformed by plague into landscapes of despair that challenge everything. Renaissance humanism teaches about human dignity and divine benevolence. Bodies lie in doorways where they fell, some covered with cloth by family members who lack the strength to carry them to burial grounds. Others exposed to elements and scavengers that reduce human remains to components of urban decay. The death carts make their rounds throughout the day, collecting corpses with efficiency that reflects months of practice in the logistics of mass mortality. The drivers and handlers are usually criminals or desperate men who accept wages that others refuse. Payment for work that guarantees exposure to plague and probable death. Within weeks of beginning employment, you document each death in records that serve both medical and administrative purposes, because the city requires accurate counts of mortality for planning purposes, tax assessment, and the grim calculations that determine when normal civic functions can resume. Your handwriting becomes mechanical, recording names, ages, and symptoms in entries that reduce individual tragedy to statistical data. The mass graves outside the city walls are excavated by workers who labor in shifts because the work is too dangerous and depressing for any individual to sustain for extended periods. Bodies are laid in rows, sometimes in wooden coffins, but more often wrapped in cloth or placed directly in earth that will receive thousands of Florence's citizens before the plague runs its course. The smell of the burial grounds is indescribable, a combination of decay, quicklime, and burning flesh that carries for miles when the wind shifts, reminding the entire city of mortality that has become the dominant fact of daily existence. You develop the ability to breathe through your mouth and ignore sensory input that would overwhelm anyone not hardened by constant exposure to death. Church services continue despite the danger, because people need spiritual comfort even when they cannot receive medical help. But many priests have died along with their congregations, leaving religious duties to be performed by whoever survives long enough to maintain the rituals that provide meaning in circumstances that seem to prove God has abandoned his creation. You attend these services when possible, kneeling in pews where gaps mark the recent deaths of regular worshippers, listening to sermons that struggle to explain why divine justice would permit such suffering among the faithful who have committed no sins greater than those of any previous generation. The economic impact of plague is as devastating as its medical effects, because commerce requires living customers, functioning transportation, and social trust that encourages people to gather in markets where goods are exchanged. Shops stand empty, craftsmen's workshops fall silent, and the banking houses that made Florence wealthy find themselves managing the estates of dead clients while struggling to maintain liquidity in economic systems disrupted by mortality. Food becomes scarce because farmers die along with city dwellers, because transportation systems break down when drivers and handlers perish, and because the complex networks of trade that supply urban populations cannot function when death claims the merchants, bankers, and skilled workers who make commerce possible. You see starvation alongside plague, malnutrition that weakens immune systems already challenged by disease, and the social breakdown that occurs when normal institutions cannot cope with crises that exceed all previous experience and planning. Children orphaned by plague wander streets where no one can afford to take responsibility for their care. Wealthy flee to country estates when plague appears in their neighborhoods, abandoning palaces and businesses to servants who often die while trying to maintain properties that owners may never reclaim. You tend the poor who cannot afford to escape, the artisans who lack the resources for flight, and the desperate who remain because they have nowhere else to go. Your own health deteriorates under the constant stress of exposure to disease, inadequate patrician, and the psychological pressure of witnessing suffering that seems to prove human existence is meaningless when death can claim anyone regardless of virtue, achievement, or social contribution. You develop a persistent cough, lose weight despite eating when food is available, and notice swellings in your own neck that may indicate the disease you have fought for months has finally claimed you as well. Sleep comes fitfully when exhaustion forces rest, but dreams are filled with images of death, the faces of patients you could not save, and the growing certainty that your own death will come soon, probably without the comfort of medical attention from colleagues who will be too busy or too dead to provide the care you have given others. The city's beautiful architecture becomes a backdrop for horror, because Renaissance palaces and churches provide no protection against disease that kills rich and poor with equal efficiency, that transforms artistic masterpieces into monuments to mortality, and that proves human achievement means nothing. When pestilence decides to visit a population that thought civilization provided security against natural disasters, you continue working because stopping would mean admitting defeat, because patients need whatever help medical knowledge can provide, and because the alternative to hopeless struggle is despair that offers no purpose for continued existence in circumstances that seem designed to destroy faith in human worth and divine benevolence. Your final entry in the medical records notes the symptoms you have observed in yourself, the treatments you have attempted, and the progression of disease that will probably kill you within days of this last. Documentation of plague's victory over another physician who thought knowledge and dedication could triumph over forces that operate beyond human control or understanding. The beak mask will be passed to another doctor, if any can be found willing to wear it, and the death cart will collect your body along with those of patients you tried to save. Because plague recognizes no distinction between healer and victim when death comes to claim. Another resident of Florence during the years when beauty and horror lived side by side in the birthplace of Renaissance culture. The Medici princes. You are Lorenzo de Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of Florence and patron of the arts. In the year 1478, you wake in the Palazzo Medici, the family's magnificent residence that serves as both home and symbol of the banking empire that has made your family the most powerful and wealthy dynasty in Renaissance Italy. Your chambers are masterpieces of Renaissance luxury, decorated with frescoes painted by artists whose names will be remembered for centuries, furnished with objects crafted by master artisans using techniques and materials that represent the pinnacle of human artistic achievement, and filled with books, manuscripts, and works of art that make your private rooms more culturally significant than most royal palaces. The bed you sleep in is a work of art in itself, carved from rare woods and inlaid with precious metals and stones, covered with silk woven in patterns that demonstrate both artistic sophistication and economic power. Surrounded by tapestries that tell stories from classical mythology in threads of gold and silver that catch morning light like captured stars. Your morning routine involves being attended by servants who understand that serving the Medici family requires not just competence but artistic sensibility, because every aspect of your life is designed to demonstrate that wealth. Properly applied, can elevate human existence to levels that approach divine perfection. You dress in clothing that represents months of work by the finest tailor, weavers, and craftsmen in Italy. Silk doublets embroidered with threads of precious metal, hose dyed with colors that cost fortunes to produce, and accessories that include jewelry designed by artists whose other works decorate churches and palaces. Throughout Europe, breakfast is served in a dining hall decorated with frescoes that depict the Medici family's rise to power, their patronage of arts and learning, and their role in transforming Florence from a provincial Italian city into the cultural capital of the Renaissance world. The meal itself consists of delicacies imported from across the Mediterranean, prepared by cooks whose skills rival those of royal chefs, and served on plates made from gold and decorated with artistic excellence that makes eating an aesthetic experience. Your daily schedule balances the practical demands of managing a banking empire that extends throughout Europe, with the cultural activities that have made you the most celebrated patron of Renaissance art, literature, and philosophy. You review financial reports from Medici banks in London, Bruges, and Constantinople, while planning commissions for artists whose work will beautify Florence and immortalize Medici patronage. The palazzo itself serves as both residence and cultural center, where scholars, artists, and philosophers gather to discuss ideas that are reshaping European thought, where new artistic techniques are developed and refined, and where the synthesis of classical learning and Christian faith creates intellectual frameworks that will influence human culture for centuries. Your private study contains one of the finest libraries in Europe, with manuscripts and books that represent the accumulated wisdom of ancient and modern civilizations. Greek texts rescued from Constantinople, Latin classics that preserve Roman learning, and contemporary works by humanist scholars who dedicate their writings to Medici. Patronage create a collection that scholars travel across continents to consult. Morning meetings with artists include discussions of commissions that will transform Florence into a living museum of Renaissance achievement. Churches decorated with frescoes that demonstrate new techniques in perspective and anatomy. Palaces designed according to classical principles recovered from ancient texts, and sculptures that rival the masterpieces of antiquity while expressing distinctly Renaissance sensibilities. Michelangelo Buonarroti is among the artists who work under your patronage, creating sculptures and paintings that demonstrate human potential for divine creation, that express Renaissance confidence in human capability, and that will inspire artists for centuries while serving as monuments to Medici taste and generosity. Your involvement in artistic projects extends beyond simple financial support to active participation in the creative process, because Medici patronage represents not just wealth, but sophisticated understanding of artistic technique, classical tradition, and cultural significance that elevates both patron and artist above merely commercial relationships. Political meetings occur in chambers designed to impress visitors with Medici power and sophistication. Rooms decorated with maps showing the extent of Medici banking operations. Portraits of family members who have shaped Italian politics, and artistic treasures that demonstrate the family's commitment to cultural advancement alongside economic success. The Medici Bank operates throughout Europe, providing services to kings, popes, and merchants whose enterprises require capital, credit, and financial expertise that only the most sophisticated banking houses can provide. Your decisions affect trade routes, currency, values, and political alliances that shape the destiny of nations. Your correspondence includes letters from rulers throughout Europe who seek Medici financial support, scholars who dedicate works to your patronage, and artists who compete for commissions that will establish their reputations while advancing Medici cultural influence throughout the Renaissance world. The cultural salons held in the Palazzo attract the finest minds of the Renaissance. Humanist philosophers who synthesize classical and Christian thought, poets who create new forms of literary expression, and scientists whose investigations of natural phenomena challenge medieval assumptions while expanding human knowledge of the physical world. These gatherings represent the intellectual flowering that characterizes Renaissance culture at its peak, where ideas are exchanged freely among people whose education, refinement, and cultural sophistication create conditions for the kind of creative synthesis that produces revolutionary advances in human understanding and artistic expression. Your patronage of learning extends to supporting scholars who translate ancient texts, establish schools that spread humanist education, and develop new forms of artistic and literary expression that will influence European culture long after the Medici family's political power has faded into historical memory. The gardens surrounding the palazzo are designed according to classical principles recovered from ancient Roman texts, featuring plantings that demonstrate both aesthetic sophistication and scientific understanding of botany, horticulture, and landscape architecture that transforms natural beauty into artistic statements about human capability and divine creation. Evening entertainments showcase the cultural achievements that Medici patronage has made possible. Musical performances by composers who work under family support. Dramatic presentations of classical and contemporary works, and literary readings by poets whose careers depend on aristocratic patronage that provides both financial support and cultural legitimacy. The dining hall where these entertainments occur is itself a work of art, decorated with frescoes that celebrate Medici history, while demonstrating artistic techniques that represent the highest achievements of Renaissance culture, furnished with objects that combine utility with beauty in ways that elevate daily life. Two levels of aesthetic sophistication unknown in previous eras. Conversation during these gatherings covers topics that range from classical philosophy to contemporary politics, from artistic technique to theological questions, creating intellectual environments where ideas are developed, refined, and transmitted among people whose education and cultural refinement make them capable of understanding and advancing human knowledge. Your personal collection of art includes works by the greatest masters of the Renaissance, pieces that demonstrate both artistic excellence and cultural significance, objects that will be treasured in museums and private collections for centuries while serving as evidence of Medici taste, generosity, and commitment to cultural advancement. The Palazzo's chapel is decorated with frescoes that represent the pinnacle of Renaissance religious art, combining traditional Christian themes with classical artistic techniques in ways that express the humanist synthesis of faith and reason that characterizes the most sophisticated Renaissance. Thinking about humanity's relationship to divine creation, your daily life unfolds against backgrounds of artistic beauty that most people see only in churches and public buildings. Because Medici wealth has created private environments that rival the most magnificent public spaces, while serving as laboratories for artistic experimentation and cultural development. Private tutors provide instruction in classical languages, literature, philosophy, and contemporary scholarship that makes you not just a patron of learning, but an active participant in the intellectual developments that distinguish Renaissance culture from medieval thought, but prepare you to make informed decisions about artistic and scholarly projects that require both financial support and educated appreciation. The contrast between your luxurious existence and the suffering that plague brings to Florence's poor creates moral challenges that humanist philosophy addresses through theories about social responsibility, divine providence, and the proper use of wealth that God has entrusted to families like the Medici for purposes that transcend mere personal pleasure. Your philanthropy includes support for hospitals, orphanages, and charitable institutions that provide assistance to Florence's most vulnerable citizens, demonstrating that Medici wealth serves broader social purposes while earning spiritual merit that humanist theology considers essential for salvation despite material prosperity. The palazzo serves as a symbol of what human achievement can accomplish when resources are applied with wisdom, taste, and commitment to cultural advancement that benefits not just individual families, but entire civilizations that are elevated by patron support for artistic, scholarly, and philosophical enterprises. Your legacy will include not just the artworks and institutions that Medici patronage has created, but the example of how wealth can be used to advance human culture, support creative achievement, and demonstrate that material success can serve spiritual purposes when properly directed toward the common good that benefits all humanity. Sleep comes easily in chambers decorated with the finest art of the Renaissance, surrounded by evidence of human achievement at its peak, confident that your life serves purposes that transcend individual pleasure, while creating cultural monuments that will inspire future generations to pursue beauty, truth, and excellence in all human endeavors. Now let me tell you the story of Dr. Alessandro Benedetti, whose life represents the transition from scholarly physician to plague doctor, from Renaissance humanist to desperate survivor trying to heal the unhealable while witnessing the collapse of everything humanist. Philosophy promised about human dignity and divine benevolence. Alessandro was born in 1445 in Verona to a family of physicians who had served northern Italian cities for 3 generations, combining traditional medical knowledge with the new anatomical studies that characterize Renaissance advances in understanding human physiology and disease processes. His education at the University of Padua exposed him to the latest developments in medical theory, anatomical dissection, and the synthesis of classical medical texts with contemporary observations that promise to revolutionize the healing arts through scientific investigation and empirical observation. Alessandro's early career was spent treating wealthy patients whose ailments were manageable through careful diet, herbal remedies, and the kind of attentive care that money could purchase from physicians who combined medical knowledge with cultural refinement that made them welcome guests in aristocratic households. He established a practice in Florence in 1470, attracted by the city's reputation for cultural sophistication, wealthy clientele, and the intellectual environment that made Renaissance Florence the most stimulating place in Europe for learned professionals who wanted to combine financial success with scholarly achievement. His patients included members of prominent Florentine families, artists whose work was transforming European culture, and scholars whose investigations of natural phenomena were expanding human knowledge in directions that promised to unlock the secrets of divine creation through rational investigation. Alessandro published treatises on anatomy and physiology that contributed to Renaissance medical knowledge, earning recognition from colleagues throughout Europe who respected his combination of classical learning, contemporary observation, and elegant Latin prose that made his writings influential in academic circles. When plague appeared in Florence in 1478, Alessandro initially approached the crisis with confidence that his education, scientific method, and accumulated medical experience would provide effective responses to disease that previous generations had faced without the advantages of Renaissance learning and investigative techniques. The reality of plague destroyed his confidence within weeks, as patients died regardless of treatment. As medical theory proved useless against disease that killed according to patterns no human learning could predict or prevent. And as the cultural achievements of Renaissance Florence became meaningless in the face of mortality that reduced human accomplishment to rotting flesh, Alessandro's transformation from court physician to plague doctor required abandoning everything he had believed about medical practice, human dignity, and divine providence. Accepting work that exposed him to certain death while providing no hope of actually healing the diseases he was called to treat. The beak, mask, and leather costume became symbols of his professional and personal transformation, protecting his identity while marking him as someone who had abandoned normal social relationships for the deadly embrace of pestilence that claimed colleagues, patients, and eventually everyone who remained in plague-stricken cities. His medical records document the progression of plague through Florence's population, the failure of traditional treatments, and his own gradual understanding that Renaissance humanism's celebration of human potential meant nothing when faced with natural forces that operated beyond human control or comprehension. The wealthy patients, who had once sought his services, fled the city or died along with their servants, leaving Alessandro to tend the poor who could not escape, the desperate who remained because they had nowhere to go, and the dying who needed comfort more than medical treatment. Alessandro's letters to colleagues who had escaped to the countryside described the collapse of everything he had believed about civilization, progress, and divine benevolence, revealing the despair that consumed physicians who discovered their learning was powerless against forces that reduced human achievement to cosmic irrelevance. He died in 1479, after 13 months of plague service, his body worn out by constant exposure to disease, inadequate nutrition, and the psychological stress of witnessing suffering that exceeded human capacity to understand or endure, without losing faith in everything that had made life meaningful. Alessandro's medical instruments were burned along with his body, following procedures designed to prevent further spread of plague, destroying the tools that had represented his professional identity and scholarly achievement, while eliminating any physical evidence of his contributions to Renaissance medical knowledge. His death was recorded in city records as another casualty, plague, without mention of his scholarly achievements, his contributions to medical knowledge, or his sacrifice in serving patients when other physicians had fled to save themselves from disease that made heroes and cowards indistinguishable in their mortality. In the winter of 1479, something extraordinary began happening in the plague-stricken districts of Florence. It started with reports from survivors about phantom physicians who tended the sick during night hours, invisible healers who provided care that exceeded anything living doctors could offer, and supernatural assistance that reduced suffering, while maintaining dignity for patients who faced inevitable death. The first incidents were reported by families who had given up hope of medical attention, because living physicians were either dead or fled, and who discovered that their dying relatives had received care during hours when no human doctor was supposed to be available. Wounds had been cleaned and dressed with skill that exceeded amateur nursing. Patients had been positioned to ease breathing and reduce pain, and medications had been administered according to procedures that required medical knowledge unavailable to ordinary families trying to care for plague victims. Similar reports came from throughout the city, describing identical phenomena: medical care provided by invisible hands, treatments administered with expertise that suggested professional training, and comfort given to dying patients by healers who seemed to understand suffering better than any living physician. Alessandro Benedetti, now dying from plague himself, initially dismissed these reports as hallucinations caused by fever, desperation, and the psychological stress that accompanied watching loved ones die without adequate medical care or hope of recovery. But when Alessandro witnessed similar phenomena during his own final illness, he was forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal experience was occurring in plague-stricken Florence. Something that suggested medical knowledge and compassion persisted beyond individual death. The phantom physicians seemed to work with invisible instruments, undetectable medications, and techniques that provided comfort without curing disease, offering dignity to patients who faced death, while demonstrating that healing involved more than just preserving life. Most remarkably, the supernatural healers seemed to understand the emotional and spiritual needs of dying patients, providing not just medical care, but the kind of compassionate attention that living doctors were too overwhelmed, too frightened, or too dead to offer. Some families claimed to recognize the spectral healers as physicians who had died earlier in the plague, colleagues who had returned to continue practicing medicine even after death had claimed their own lives, suggesting that professional dedication transcended mortality. The phantom assistants provided not just practical help, but psychological comfort, demonstrating that the healing arts involved spiritual as well as physical dimensions, that medical practice at its highest level served human dignity rather than just biological survival. The supernatural activity gradually faded as the plague epidemic ended and normal medical practice resumed. as if the ghostly intervention had been temporary assistance during a period when living physicians could not provide adequate care for patients who needed both medical attention and human compassion. The families who experienced phantom medical care never forgot the winter when invisible healers had provided comfort during the darkest period of plague, when supernatural physicians had demonstrated that death was not the end of professional commitment to relieving human suffering. While Dr. Alessandro Benedetti tended plague victims in the narrow streets below, a completely different reality existed in the Palazzo Medici, where Lorenzo the Magnificent lived, surrounded by artistic treasures and cultural achievements that represented the pinnacle of Renaissance civilization, while remaining completely insulated from the suffering that plague brought to Florence's poor. The contrast between Lorenzo's luxurious existence and Alessandro's deadly work was so extreme that they seemed to inhabit different worlds rather than the same city. One surrounded by beauty that celebrated human achievement, the other immersed in horror that revealed human vulnerability to forces beyond cultural control. Lorenzo's daily routine continued according to patterns that prioritized artistic patronage, intellectual discussion, and cultural refinement over the practical concerns of governing a city where thousands of citizens were dying from disease that respected neither wealth nor social position. The palazzo's magnificent chambers provided perfect insulation from the sights, sounds, and smells of plague that filled Florence's streets, allowing Medici family life to continue with minimal disruption despite the catastrophe that was destroying the city's population and economic foundation. When plague affected the Medici household, resources were available to provide the finest medical care, imported medications, and country retreats where family members could escape urban disease, while maintaining the luxurious lifestyle that banking wealth made possible. Lorenzo's understanding of plague was theoretical rather than experiential, based on reports from administrators rather than direct observation of suffering, filtered through cultural frameworks that emphasized divine providence, classical precedent, and humanist philosophy rather than practical medical reality. The contrast between Lorenzo's immortality through artistic patronage and Alessandro's anonymous death in plague service represented the fundamental inequality that characterized Renaissance society, where cultural achievements were built on foundations that included both marble palaces and mass graves. Lorenzo's legacy includes some of the greatest artistic achievements in human history, works that continue to inspire centuries after their creation. While Alessandro's contributions to medical knowledge were destroyed along with his plague-contaminated instruments, leaving no trace of his scholarly achievements or professional sacrifice. Both men served their communities according to their circumstances and capabilities, but their deaths revealed the different forms that service could take. One remembered forever for cultural patronage, the other forgotten immediately. Despite sacrificing his life to provide medical care during humanity's greatest need. By 1485, Florence had survived the plague epidemic, but remained forever changed by the experience of witnessing Renaissance confidence in human achievement. Confronted by natural forces that operated beyond cultural control, artistic beauty, or humanist philosophy, the city's recovery involved rebuilding not just physical infrastructure, but also intellectual frameworks that could accommodate the reality of human vulnerability alongside celebration of human achievement, that could balance Renaissance optimism with recognition of mortality that remained beyond human prediction or prevention. The survivors included people who had experienced both the cultural flowering that made Renaissance Florence legendary and by the biological catastrophe that proved human achievement meant nothing when pestilence decided to visit populations that thought civilization provided security against natural disasters. Their experiences demonstrated that beauty and horror could coexist in the same time and place, that cultural sophistication offered no protection against biological reality, and that human greatness existed alongside human fragility in ways that required intellectual frameworks, flexible enough to encompass both triumph and tragedy. And so we leave Renaissance Florence, where marble palaces gleamed while plague carts rumbled through narrow streets, where Michelangelo carved divine beauty while doctors watched human bodies rot, where the heights of cultural achievement existed, alongside the depths of biological horror. These contrasting lives reveal the price of civilization, the fragility of human achievement, and the complex relationship between beauty and suffering that characterizes periods when cultural flowering, perhaps despite, or perhaps because of, intimate contact with mortality that reminds everyone of life's ultimate uncertainty. Lorenzo de Medici and Dr. Alessandro Benedetti lived in the same city, breathed the same air, and depended on the same human community. But they inhabited worlds so different they might have been separate species, one divine and immortal through art, the other human and disposable despite knowledge and dedication. The frescoes still glow with Renaissance beauty. The plague pits still whisper with the voices of the forgotten dead, and the contrast between palace and hospital still challenges our understanding of what progress means when it leaves some people surrounded by beauty, while others die in streets that art cannot purify. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in your clean bed, with medical care available at the touch of a button, remember the plague doctors in their leather masks, breathing herbs and despair, tending patients they could not save while serving a city that barely acknowledged their sacrifice. Their masks have crumbled, their records have been burned, and their names have been forgotten by everyone except the historians who remember that cultural flowering requires foundations that include both beauty and horror, both artistic achievement and anonymous sacrifice. The Renaissance created art that still inspires, architecture that still amazes, and intellectual achievements that still influence modern thought. But it also demonstrated that human progress can coexist with human suffering, that cultural magnificence can emerge alongside biological catastrophe, and that the price of greatness includes costs that are often paid by people who receive none. of its benefits: patron and doctor, palace and plague house, immortal beauty and mortal horror, all existed within the same system that represented both the best and worst of human experience. Both our potential for creating transcendent beauty and our vulnerability to forces that reduce achievement to irrelevance. Sleep well, knowing that your health is protected by knowledge that plague doctors died to acquire, that your safety rests on medical advances built from the suffering of physicians who served without hope of cure, that your cultural inheritance includes both the beauty they helped preserve and the sacrifice they made to keep civilization functioning during humanity's darkest hours. Good night.